This is a special episode of History as It Happens, and we are on location at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, inside the David M. Rubenstein Visitor Center, for the first in a two-part series of conversations about Jefferson's legacy, the important mission of institutions such as Monticello and the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, and the importance of holding conversations about uncomfortable topics during our hyper-polarized times. It is an honor to be here, to be joined with by two terrific interpreters of the past. Brandon Dillard, you are the Director of Historic Interpretation and Audience Engagement at Monticello. On behalf of the Washington Times, thank you for welcoming me here.
Well, thank you, Martin. It's a pleasure to have you and a pleasure to be on the show.
And historian Alan Taylor, who is the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Chair at the University of Virginia, two-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize for History. It is good to see you again, my friend.
Thank you, Martin. It's always good to be on your program.
I had the pleasure of meeting you last fall on my trip here to Monticello.
I should get a gold watch soon.
Yes, exactly. Well, you know, the History as it happens, tote bags and coffee mugs are stuck on a freighter somewhere in the Indian Ocean. So
well, supply chain problem.
Yeah, that's right. During my annual visit, I was able to meet you in person, finally, after all the Zoom calls, and that was great. Charlottesville, the University of Virginia, is just a beautiful part of the country. So before I get even more serious here, with all these weighty subjects we're going to discuss, I just want to say that I do love it here. As I mentioned, I visit every year for my birthday. It feels like I'm traveling back in time, as close as you can get. If you want to feel what it's like to walk around in the 18th century, you just have to walk the grounds at Monticello. You learn everything about Jefferson's mind, his family, free and enslaved, referring to the Hemmingses, of course. Sally Hemings was Martha Jefferson's half-sister, right?
Right.
So the title of this episode, What Jefferson Wanted, really something that's been on my mind quite a bit lately. It's the reason why I visited Mount Vernon, did one of these podcasts there last year, reason why I got in touch with both of you. Why is it that we Americans keep going back to our founders? We cite the founders, cherry pick their ideas to support any policy we want to get behind today. We consult their wisdom. And maybe even some Americans today say, to hell with these 18th century dudes. What do they know about life in a modern society? Brandon, why don't we start with that broad subject? Why do we keep going back to our founders?
I think we always have. That's one of the things about American rhetoric whenever we are discussing things about what it means to be an American, about what democracy means. Even in these highly partisan debates that are not new, different founders are brought down on either side of the fight, and often the same founder will be brought down on either side of the fight, depending on what that founder said, when, and who they were talking to. We're a nation born in ideas, and we always have had these ideas at the root of who we are that have always been contentious ideas.
Yeah, I agree with what he's saying. The United States is an invented country. It's less than 3 centuries old, so we don't have the option to go back to mythic time in order to find some sort of mythic origin for the people, defined in some sort of ethnic or racial terms. Instead, we're a mixed group of peoples, and we are defined by a cluster of ideas, and those ideas largely originate with the group we call the founders.
Whenever I ask myself, should I do another podcast about subject X or subject Y, something that's old, why are you going back to this again? I often think about what one of my favorite historians has said about that. Christopher Clark is his name. He said, "The subject may be old, but the issues are fresh." Mm-hmm. You think about what's been going on in our own country here for the last several years, especially after the summer of 2020, suddenly the past looks different. Maybe not as inspiring.
Well, I was teaching today on the ratification of the U.S. Constitution and focusing on the anti-federalists who had a deep distrust of any concentration of power. And we used to say, well, the anti-federalists lost, but have they really lost? We still have plenty of anti-federalists today. So as Brandon said, these contentious issues are still very much with us. We're always going to have this polarity between people who are comfortable with a strong national government, seeing it as the solution to problems, versus people who see that very strength of the national government as the source of their problems.
When I went to Mount Vernon last year, I did a What Did Washington Want? And I actually didn't know that much about Washington. I never read a cradle-to-grave biography about him prior to that that podcast episode. But what I was surprised to learn as I started looking deeper into it was how much he had to say that is still actually relevant today. Yes, it was an 18th century context, but for instance, he was really worried about hyperpartisanship, or what they might have called factionalism, demagoguery, right? We're all dealing with those problems now. So we're going to talk about Jefferson in that same context. Before I get really granular here, Brandon, back to the earlier point that Alan was making, what often strikes me about returning to the founders is we can't really talk about them as a group of people who agreed on everything. Who are we talking about when it comes to the founders, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Having worked in public history for a long time now, it's interesting to see how visitors will often come and say things like, well, our founders believed. And there aren't many things that our founders believed all at the same time. I've heard guides here make this joke, I've made it myself, that the only time we all agreed on anything is when we were all fighting the British. And then as soon as the founders weren't fighting the British anymore, they started to fight with each other, which is something that you see repeated and echoed in subsequent generations.
But even then, right, there are deep divisions in the
Sure, I
Patriot
mean,
cause.
they're fighting with each other even while they're fighting the British.
That's true. That is
because
true.
they had different visions of what the Republic and its union of states should be.
What strikes me, a final point before we move on, about folks who like to cite the founders is how often they miss things that they actually did say very explicitly, but they don't want to apply those ideas to our modern-day circumstances. And here's an example. The founders, were deeply suspicious about extreme concentrations of wealth in the hands of a few. We seem to have forgotten that, haven't we?
It's standard practice wherever you are on the political spectrum to cherry pick from the founders in order to vindicate your own particular perspective.
So let's talk about democracy. I'm not sure if you guys are aware of this. This has been a debate in our country the last few years. I don't know if you've heard. Democracy is in trouble in the United States, often for reasons that I think are overlooked. I mean, I think we're dealing with massive institutional failure in our country over the past 20 years. But anyway, democracy. I saw a poll the other day that Americans don't agree on what democracy means. Well, that's nothing new. They didn't agree on it on a definition of democracy. It was dangerous to men like Washington, right? We can even have a debate over whether we were a democracy until what point in history, right? What is Jeffersonian democracy? What did he see for our country in that category?
Well, Jefferson definitely believed that the electorate should be broadened to include all adult males. And that was a controversial position at the time when there was a property requirement in just about every state, restricting the electorate to those men who could support a family and could employ a family on the property that he owned, meaning a farm or a shop. And as American society will industrialize and a growing number of Americans won't own their own farm or their own shop but will work for wages, then the electorate would shrink dramatically unless you adopt a more Jeffersonian definition of who the people should be.
One of the most important things that I think we are tasked with here is that people who come to Monticello, they come here, they're on vacation. They might be very familiar with the history of this site. They might not be. And that's not saying anything against a lot of visitors who come here who maybe are not trained historians. That doesn't mean they're not smart. Maybe they're trained engineers. Maybe they're literally retired rocket scientists, but they didn't take a history class in a number of years. So we have to have these conversations like the very one that you're asking now. You know, what is the meaning of democracy and what were the founders' ideas and what would they mean to subsequent generations? That is a very complex and nuanced conversation. And so it's important to invite people to think about it and to invite them to grapple with the complexity and to grapple with the nuance as opposed to having an oversimplified ideal of what it is.
Jeffersonian democracy, Alan, was not mass politics. It was still more of a top-down political organization, right?
Well, certainly in Thomas Jefferson's administration as President of the United States, I mean, he definitely has a notion that there is a natural aristocracy of people that prove their merit by winning the approval of the people, by doing what the people needed. Nobody anywhere among the so-called founders believes that blacksmiths or carpenters or farmers should do the actual governing. And Jefferson's no different on that score, but he believes that he belongs to a natural aristocracy that is in tune with the people, that will promote their interests and protect their interests.
Here's a citation from Sean Wilentze's book, The Rise of American Democracy.
The Holy Script.
That's right, my favorite book. I'm going to Wilentze before I go to Taylor. I do have your book over here, Alan.
Yes,
so
but it's not nearly as worn.
That's right. Well, I bought Sean's book as a paperback, so it doesn't hold together as sturdily as a
He ought
hardcover.
to give you a hardcover.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, he's also been on the show, as you know, many
Yes,
times.
I know.
So,
He's always good.
I love Sean's work, as you know. I love your work as well. In his chapter called Jefferson's Two Presidencies, he concludes that the links among Jefferson, republicanism, and democratic reform were less straightforward. By beating back Federalist presumption, the Jeffersonian ascendancy opened up the political system, encouraging and enabling self-made plebeians to reach for and attain high political office. Here was the greatest political achievement of Jefferson's two presidencies. He's referring to the two different terms because the second term was not as good as the first one. Against federalism's immense condescension and determined obstructionism, Jefferson and his party vindicated the political equality of the mass of American citizens.
I don't know a whole lot of plebeians who achieve high office. I know a lot of people like Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren, grew up in a middle-class family, and he uses this new democratizing system to get ahead and achieve the highest office in the land. So it is important what Jefferson does, which is to respect common people. And the Federalists did err on the side of telling common people, know your place and stick to it, which people didn't want to hear in the wake of the American Revolution.
When looking at Jefferson's ideas about education, I think it really underscores what Alan's talking about, which is opening up more opportunities for people within Jefferson's free white society, and this allows people to have experience of education. And then Jefferson writes, the natural leaders will rise to the top. And I think that that's a pretty radical idea for the time when it was written and much more democratic than previous iterations of education have been.
These are 18th century Enlightenment ideas, right? Disinterested men, meaning men who don't need to seek office for profit or some other type of gain, are the virtuous ones who can govern, right? But there was a democratic impulse, as you just discussed, a little bit lower down. The party organizations, if we can even call these parties at the time, were still very much top-down. They didn't have primaries, for instance, right?
No.
But I think there was a democratizing impulse. So, why does this matter? Why are we talking about Jeffersonian democracy? Well, I often hear these days that we were not a democracy. We are a republic. So how do we square that with this idea that the Jeffersonians were democratizing reformers, and now we're in upheaval today about the meaning of democracy. Rights for whom? Democracy for whom? Not so much a question there, Alan, more of a word salad, but I know you're going to make sense of that.
Where do I begin?
Yes.
I do think there are people who want to insist that we're a republic, not a democracy, because they have a conservative view of what our nation should be. And they do not want a government that's directly responsive to public opinion across the board. Now, I want to separate that out because I think on technical terms, they're actually correct. The United States is a republic rather than a democracy. And we have undemocratic features to our constitutional arrangement. The U.S. Supreme Court is a prime example. The Electoral College is a second prime example. The equal power of all states, regardless of size, in the Senate is an undemocratic feature. Those are by design. They're not by accident. The founders were trying to channel democracy, not to fulfill it. When I say the founders, I mean those who wrote the federal Constitution. And then things start to change with Jefferson because Jefferson is trying to shift this republic in as democratic a direction as he possibly can. And then Jackson will pick up where Jefferson left off.
Because when people come here, Brandon, they're coming here to check out Jefferson and his writing of the Declaration of Independence. He was the primary author. He had some good editors help him out with the final draft. They're looking at what they would consider a foundational document of American democracy. I don't really think they say this is a foundation of American republicanism, small r republicanism.
I think you'll both be pleased to hear that it wasn't that long ago. I had a school group in the house talking to them, and they said, what kind of government do we have? And they said, we're a democracy. And I said, are we? And the kids looked at me, they're probably 8th graders, and they said, well, we're an indirect democracy. I was like, oh, you got a good teacher.
That's a better answer than I could have given, and I'm not even in the 8th grade. So much has been made as well about our very divided and partisan times, people looking for comparisons. Maybe the crack up of the Weimar Republic is one that I see on social media quite often. I don't know if that really does it. The pre-Civil War, the antebellum period, the 1850s. What about the 1790s? And Jefferson's in the mix of this. Like many of the other founders, he's not a big fan of political parties. He's pretty thin-skinned, doesn't like being criticized. Yet he is ready to mix it up, isn't he? He's just as much a politician as anyone else.
Well, he is, but he has a notion that his party is not a party, that the Republicans are the real Americans. So it's not a rhetoric that's so different from what we hear today. And that what he's doing is he's fighting back against what he sees as a Federalist plot to subvert the Republic and to introduce a monarchy. Now, it's still, I think, very hard to tell, does Jefferson really believe this? I think he did, even though there's really no plausible evidence that the Federalists were pushing for a monarchy. But as he sees it, if you're not trying to democratize the Republic, then you must be pushing to monarchize the Republic. And so he saw himself leading not a political party, but a mass movement that is meant to preserve the Republic against the Federalists.
Do you think the 1790s resemble our own time when it comes to this type of division?
I think that there are many Americans today who do not value a two-party system, who do not regard the opposition as legitimate, who think of themselves as the only legitimate expression of a real America, and are increasingly open to the possibility of interfering in the electoral process in ways that will tip the balance in their own favor.
I think the answer to that question then is yes. I think there are some important similarities. I mean, it's always easy to take comparisons too far. Another area you didn't mention is the media. Well, there was no TV as far as I know in those days, but pamphlets in the early newspapers. Today, the idea is all of this bitter factionalism or partisanship is bad for our country. But you can make the argument that the early newspapers, which were truly scurrilous, especially the Republican press and their attacks on John Adams and the Federalists, you can make the argument that the political press in those days actually was good for democracy because it encouraged participation in politics and led people to believe they had a stake in the outcome. Do you agree with that?
I agree with that, but I'd also say that people tended to read the other side in newspapers as well. There was a curiosity, so people would often read 2 or 3 different newspapers. I think we have a lot less of that today, and I think that's a real problem. People don't really understand what the other side is trying to say.
Are you saying that people lived in information silos?
They do now.
They do now? Yeah. So
much more so than in the past.
Right. That's what I meant, present tense. Thank you for catching me there, Alan.
I'm here for you, Martin.
Thank you. So, Brandon, when visitors come to Monticello, I mean, this was his home, mostly his retirement home. How much do you get into this? Jefferson's disdain for the ugly side of politics while very much being a politician who is ready to get dirty, even if you had somebody else writing it for him.
I think as much as we can. And, these tours are limited in their scope because they're limited by capacity and how long they can be. But we try to bring that into it because it's an important part of the story. And one of my favorite things we have is, we know Jefferson kept newspaper clippings of things that were said about him that he found insulting, and he called it libels, and he kept this notebook of libels. So we have that in his office, a recreated version, which is a great thing for interpreters here to use to talk about this very thing. And I think for many of our visitors, a lot of what you've just discussed, it's kind of news for a lot of people. Even the very basic aspects of Jefferson didn't live in the United States when the Constitution was being written, and thinking about the global context of where he actually is while the French Revolution is gearing up and breaking out. And so this very revolutionary radical man is also fomenting revolution and rebellion in another nation before he comes back and jumps right into this partisan fight.
He romanticized the French Revolution, didn't he, for a while? Eventually drops it, right? But
he goes silent on it toward the end. Yeah. The French Revolution doesn't turn out that well when you produce Napoleon Bonaparte as, in effect, a dictator.
And he hated Bonaparte.
Yeah,
as far as I know.
Yeah, with some pretty good reason.
Usurping tyrant, I think.
Yes. Well, Andrew Roberts wrote a pretty positive biography of Napoleon and King George III as well. So,
Well, I guess he likes autocratic rule.
So you were saying about scandalous newspapers. Good segue, Brandon, to our next subject. We're going to try to touch on a few different subjects about what Jefferson envisioned for our republic or our democracy and why they're still relevant today. James Callender. I heard he wrote something that Jefferson did not appreciate about his liaison with a slave girl named Sally Hemings, is how Callender probably would have put it, although even probably more vociferously than that. We're going to talk about slavery and race. Recently, the New York City Council removed, it was last year, I think, maybe the year before, a 7-foot-tall statue of Thomas Jefferson that had been in the council chambers for a really long time. Now, unlike, say, the Confederate leaders, the Confederate heroes, whose only claim to historical significance is the defense of slavery, racism, secession, Thomas Jefferson can make some other claims other than being a slave holder. But the council decided to remove his statue anyway. I presume it's because of the race issue. Brandon, do you tell the people who come here that the primary author of the Declaration of Independence may have been a racist? How do you approach Jefferson's views on race?
Very upfront, and we use Jefferson's own words, and we think that that's really the best way for visitors to understand some of these things and to grapple with them themselves. You know, Jefferson was very much a man who wrote consistently throughout the course of his life in opposition to the institution of slavery. You know, he said morally, he said it was evil. He called it a moral abomination, a deplorable crime. And yet he remained a lifelong slaveholder, and he lived a life of luxury, which was based on this economic engine. Like other enslavers of the period, Jefferson justified that or rationalized it based on the colors of people's skins. Now, what's interesting about Jefferson's own writings about this is that he also struggled with it. And when he wrote about it, he would use, as Peter Onuf says, tentative language around this. I advance it as a suspicion only. But the fact of the matter is that if you're going to understand slavery in America, you have to grapple with race. And so we do invite our visitors to consider that, because slavery has always existed, still exists, but transatlantic race-based slavery is very much something that left legacies of racism that we're still grappling with today.
The notes on the state of Virginia is what you're referring to.
Right.
Those are probably Jefferson's ugliest remarks about race that are published. Well, he only published one book, that was it.
Well, he published an earlier pamphlet before the Revolution, but the one longer work is the Notes on the State of Virginia. And yeah, Jefferson, after publishing that, and he initially published it in France, and he didn't intend it to be published in the United States. It does get published in Britain and then ultimately here, and it has a kind of impact that, he's a little uneasy with. And thereafter, he largely confines whatever anti-slavery sentiments he has to private letters written usually to Quakers or other Northern correspondents. So he sticks to his position that slavery is a moral evil and that the country would be better off without it. But he also insists that it's impossible for free black people and white people to coexist as equal citizens in this country. So he always puts an asterisk next to his plans for emancipation to say, must be linked to a forced deportation. Now, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. It's something that the country could never have afforded. So he has, in theory, a commitment to emancipation, but he links it to a plan that is utterly implausible.
William Freeling called him a conditional terminationist. You terminate slavery provided you can reach these unattainable conditions.
Yeah, an impossible criteria.
Yet he makes some moves against slavery in his early political career. And then he basically, I'm actually taking this from the Monticello website, he goes silent on it after 1785. Why?
He remains consistent, as Alan said, privately, right? And publicly, some of that could be because of some of those very things that happened after some of his words are broadly published. A lot of people have talked about this over the years as saying that Jefferson softens a little bit in his older age. I don't think that's right. I think that he does remain consistent about this, but in his own words, he could not discover a, quote, practicable solution, right? Mm-hmm. So this is what Alan's talking about. And I would say even further that confronting race and that aspect of it can be tricky, particularly right now, but it is something that most people seem somewhat prepared for. But the latter point of expatriation is a very difficult conversation. And
Really?
most of our visitors are not familiar with expatriation, and they're not familiar even with conversations about countries like Liberia or Sierra Leone.
Later in life, Jefferson comes around to the idea that you can weaken slavery through what he called diffusion, spread it out over a larger part of the continental United States, and it would become weaker and maybe wither away. Well, what was the reasoning there, Alan?
Well, I think we have to remember that Jefferson is not saying these things alone. Jefferson is expressing a commonly held idea among an entire class of slaveholders here in Virginia, who are very upset at the prospect that Congress is going to intervene and prevent the prospective state of Missouri from becoming a state unless they adopt a program of gradual emancipation that utterly appalls the political leadership of Virginia, including Jefferson. So Jefferson doesn't invent the idea of diffusion, but he's entirely on board with it. Now, critics of the idea would say, well, by that logic, we have to have slavery everywhere in the United States in order to weaken it. And what diffusing slavery does is it actually widens the market for people to buy slaves. If slavery is legal everywhere, that means everywhere people are in the market to buy slaves, and their value goes up, and therefore the likelihood that masters are going to free their slaves goes down.
That's interesting because decades after Jefferson dies, he dies in 1826, the slave power believed that slavery could really only survive through expansion.
No.
When it comes to Jefferson's vision for the Republic, Alan, to your point, he couldn't bring himself to see a future where free black people could coexist with whites.
Yeah, and
It's disappointing when you think of the brilliance of his mind that he couldn't get to that point.
yeah, but I think we need to put Jefferson in the context of the people he interacts with.
Please do. Yeah.
And Brandon brought up the point. He's keeping clippings of things that he finds hurtful that people are saying about him. People are saying a lot of hurtful things about Jefferson. He can live with them more when there are people outside Virginia who are saying these things. He really does not like confrontation. And so this is not a good quality for somebody who's pursuing a political career. But this is right at the heart of Jefferson. He has a very thin skin. He doesn't like confrontation. And so he comes across to a lot of people as being evasive, tricky, deceptive. That's not what he's intending to do. But the reality is that he doesn't want to directly tell people what he thinks about many things. Every white person who owns slaves in Virginia, virtually everyone, will say it's not safe to have blacks as free. They'll be able to move around, they'll be able to get guns, they'll have reason to hate us, and then they're going to come to try to kill us, and there'll be a race war, and one race or the other will be exterminated. Jefferson doesn't invent that, but he latches a hold of it. He believes it because everyone in the circle that he moves in here in Virginia believes it. And so
you believe he actually believes it? It's not
Yes.
just a justification he's
No.
picking up to...
he believes this.
Because some people today question his commitment to the anti-slavery cause, if you can even call it that, because of the reasons you just cited. Right? He doesn't publicly speak out. He doesn't take a leadership role when he was willing to take leadership roles in other areas, obviously.
Yeah, this is an area where he does not want to be out of tune with his fellow Virginians. So he does something interesting. He thinks that if he creates the University of Virginia, that he can train an enlightened new generation, and that enlightened new generation will be able to solve the problems of race and slavery in a way that he could not and frankly would not do in his own lifetime. Now, it turns out the University of Virginia does not have the effect that Jefferson believed that it would have.
I've heard of that school. Do you work there?
I do, yes.
Okay. So how do you deal with visitors who say, listen, I'm tired of hearing about all the greatness of American democracy. Right from day one, even the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence cannot foresee a republic with blacks and whites living equally.
Yeah, I mean, we welcome that conversation too. I think that's our most important function here is to welcome conversation around this stuff. And we do our best to present the full story as broadly as we can so that people can grapple with those different ideas. This is key to understanding this stuff, and something that Alan just said that I really I'm going to keep coming back to this importance around nuance. But Jefferson, if you don't look at what he's saying and what he's writing within the context of the times in which he's writing it and the people who he's writing it around, then you can't understand it. That also means that often people will say, well, he's just a man of his times. But that's also not right. This is Thomas Jefferson.
Yes, exactly.
He was very much not a man of his times in many ways. And so the nuance is being able to hold these ideas simultaneously, that Jefferson knew plenty of people who were also men of his times who said to him, slavery is wrong, and he agreed. He also had these other ideas that were very much in keeping with the Virginia planter class of his generation.
When you look at Jefferson's personal views on race and slavery and his political ones as well, he was living in a multiracial community. And some of those people were his offspring who were enslaved.
Monticello was a plantation before Thomas Jefferson was born here. It had a different name. It was called Shadwell, but it was a plantation where people of African descent were enslaved by Peter Jefferson. Monticello remained a plantation after Thomas Jefferson died. So it was a plantation longer than it was the home of Thomas Jefferson. And the vast majority of people who lived here during this historical era that we talk about mostly were enslaved African Americans. But you have to get into some of the nuance of what race means, what it means today versus what it meant then. How people self-identify is a part of this conversation, but what the law dictated was about who one's mother was. And if one's mother was a slave, so that person was a slave. And so when we look at this today, it's important to consider it all, but I don't think we can even begin to fathom what life was like for people living on this plantation who are connected not only through bonds of slavery, but also bonds of kinship.
We don't know what Jefferson thought of his mixed-race children, right?
He never acknowledged them, no.
Never acknowledged them. And Virginia law stated that his children with Sally Hemings were white, right, based on their lineage.
Mm-hmm. And some of them did pass as white, but
they were enslaved white people. I mean, that sounds like a contradiction.
Well, it's what Brandon said, is that your status comes from your mother.
That's right.
Right. So Sally Hemings is 3/4 white in her ancestry. Her children by Thomas Jefferson then are only an 1/8 African in their descent. And their complexions would be about average, I think, for Virginians of that time. That's not uncommon. Visitors to Virginia in the early 19th century often comment on seeing what they called white Negroes or white slaves. Again, are they a majority of the enslaved people? No. But are they a significant number of the enslaved people? Yes. We tend to bring this notion of black and white as being a polarity. And there are reasons for it. There will be later laws after the end of slavery that will define race as if you've got one drop of blood, then you're black and you are to be segregated and be restricted in your rights. Okay, that's not the situation in the early republic. It is true this is a multiracial community, but it's not a community of equals. That's right. There are many different gradations of respect within this community. So to be a mixed race house slave is to be in a different situation than to be probably a fully African-descended field hand who has to bear the hardest work on this particular place.
Yeah, I didn't frame my question very well. I meant to drill down when it came to Jefferson's own family, right? Mm-hmm. Here he is living with his own family members who are enslaved. His own offspring are enslaved. And I wonder, did he look at them and see them as something other than his property? They were his flesh and blood, and as you said, they appeared white.
But Jefferson has a great capacity to compartmentalize and not think about things he doesn't want to think about, or at least not share things he doesn't want to share with others. So what he thought of his own mixed-race children, who by all accounts he does not interact with, we don't know. Okay, so Madison Hemings talks about how Jefferson was around, but Jefferson just didn't engage with him or Madison Hemings' siblings. Jefferson is just going about being Jefferson.
To highlight something Alan just brought up, I mean, this is something that most of our visitors, they don't think about this in terms of the chronology because of the social impact of racial categories today. Right? Yes. And what race means today is different than what it meant in the early 20th century, which is different than what it meant in the 19th and 18th century.
And the fractions you mentioned, Alan, that was in the law. That's what you mentioned, the fractions.
Yeah, so we have a much more nuanced understanding of this today, where when we talk about it, we understand that race itself is a social construct with no biological basis whatsoever, and to even talk about it in terms of fractions is to oversimplify the realities of something that is always changing. But it surprises visitors when they learn that the Racial Integrity Act was passed here in Virginia in 1924. So this one-drop rule is a 20th century phenomenon that they're unfamiliar with. But that doesn't change the fact that it's a hard conversation for people to have based on their own identities and who they are. And in many ways, Sally Hemings has become an icon of what it meant to be a Black woman in this time, who showed her own capacity for resistance in this inhumane system, and who managed to, by negotiations and by strength, see the freedom of all of her children.
Jefferson biographer John Bowles, in his cradle-to-grave biography I have over here, Jefferson, Architect of American Liberty, refers to Jefferson as a benevolent slaveholder. Jefferson's slaves, relative to other slaves maybe in other states, were not as badly mistreated. Is there such a thing as a benevolent slaveholder, Alan?
Well, if I have to have a quick answer, it would be no. There are enslaved people from the early 19th century who, when visitors talk to them, say, do you have a good master? They will say, I'd make a better master for myself. Or they will say, they're not really masters, the system is their master. And that's the fundamental reality. If you treat a group of people as commodities who can be bought and sold, it fundamentally, at the end of the day, doesn't make much difference whether that particular master is less abusive than another one. Now, it does make a difference in your day-to-day experience. There are truly sadists who were masters. Jefferson was not a sadist. But the great injustice of the system of slavery transcends whether or not your particular master is less abusive than another master.
Because you can still be separated from your family.
Your master can die, and then you are put on the auction block to settle his or her debts.
That's what happened here. We're going to return to this issue in part 2 of this 2-part series talking about race and interpretation and the cruelty of slavery. Few areas of American history are as poorly understood as religion. I have a book here written by one Alan Taylor, American Revolutions. This is a pretty good book, Alan.
Thank you.
You say here that where Jefferson wanted a secular nation, evangelicals wanted a Protestant one, but without any one denomination favored by the state. This is in a chapter about the disestablishment of the Anglican Church in Virginia. How would you respond to someone who says, but Alan, we were founded as a Christian nation?
Well, I would say we weren't founded as a Christian nation. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't a lot of people at that time who wanted us to be a Christian nation. But the people who get revered as the founding fathers were people who were trying to secularize the country.
And what did Jefferson mean, or what did you mean when you said Jefferson wanted a secular nation?
Well, to say they want a secular nation means that they want the government to be out of the business of favoring any particular Christian denomination or, in fact, any particular faith, and to allow people to have the complete freedom to choose for themselves without the government tilting the scale in any way.
And how do you depict or interpret Jefferson's views on religion to your audiences here, Brandon, because this is a touchy subject too.
It is. I mean, we've jumped right from race, and we went from politics in America to race in America to religion. And it's one of the things that I actually enjoy about my job, because I think that the best way for us to progress as a nation and to progress as human beings is to actually listen to each other. And so all those things that you're told you're not supposed to talk about at polite dinner conversation, that's the stuff I do all day.
Well, that's why we're talking about Jefferson. He touches on all the important stuff.
But yeah, people have really strong ideas about, for obvious reasons, people's personal faiths, they inform who they are. But a lot of people have strong ideas about Jefferson's beliefs that aren't based in what Jefferson himself said, and they're based on things that they've read on, Facebook or wherever. And I think that that's something that we have to contend with, is helping visitors to sift through things that are written about the founders that are not true, and to try and understand what Jefferson actually did mean when he said some of these things, which can be pretty hard for some people to read.
Oh, he wrote some provocative things about organized religion, but he didn't hate Christianity. I think he hated priests, or some priests.
Well, priests, he has a broad definition of who a priest is. So a minister of any sort of mainstream Protestant church, such as the Presbyterians, he really didn't like Presbyterians. So Jefferson does have his own prejudices in that regard. Yeah, and he has, frankly, some unusual ideas. So he believed that you could have a Bible and you could take the miracles out and you could find a perfectly rational Jesus in there who was an ethical teacher. And he went about with a pair of scissors and some glue in order to produce his own Bible.
I think he referred to himself as a true Christian because of that.
Yes.
Which now people often take that quote out of context. When I say Jefferson was not a Christian, he did not accept Christ's divinity, they say, no, look, see, he said he was a Christian.
Yeah, and that's certainly the case.
Who did he mean by creator in the Declaration of Independence?
Well, he does mean that there is a divine creator. He comes from a body of thought that we call deism, I would argue. He does believe that there is a divine creator of the earth who creates the laws of nature, and then he doesn't interfere in the operation of the earth or of humanity, but that he does expect certain ethical behavior from humans, and that Jesus was here on earth in order to convey the ultimate truths about ethical behavior.
Jefferson's ideas on the freedom of religion and the free conscience of individuals in this country to worship as they see fit is the reason that this place exists as a historic site. And so it's really important to the story for us to talk about how Jefferson's ideas on the freedom of religion, when he died, his house was sold because his debts were so great, and the house was purchased and protected by a Jewish family from New York, the Levy family, who admired Jefferson because of his views on religious freedom. They believed they were able to worship freely because of his ideas, and they protected it for almost a century. So technically, they lived here longer than the Jefferson family.
Yeah, the idea that by not having the government favor one religion over another, you would have more religious diversity and religious freedom would thrive.
Well, yeah, I think that if you are thinking that the government ought to intervene to favor your particular religious faith and its social message, then you're not being a very good Jeffersonian.
I think the separation of church and state is under attack now. Do you agree with me?
Well, I do think that there are a lot of people in this country that would like to use government to criminalize behaviors that are contrary to their particular religious faith.
Jefferson said that these things should be kept entirely separate.
Yes, private. Religion's a private matter to Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, I mean, there is public worship, but he wants everybody to be able to publicly worship as they would like and to tolerate one another. He founds the University of Virginia, and it's the only university in the land that did not have a religious chapel and that had no religious purpose, whereas every other college and university at that time did. So he very much believes in this notion that you're training this new elite for Virginia, that religion should not be part of that education.
My own bias is showing here. I'm an atheist, so I've enjoyed Jefferson's writings on these matters, although he was not an atheist.
He's not an atheist.
No, he did not like it when he was called an atheist.
No, he didn't.
A howling atheist is what he was called.
Right.
All right, last subject before we wrap up here. Thank you for tolerating my meandering questions. What I come away with when I visit Monticello, Brandon, is Jefferson's belief in human progress. How do you convey that Jeffersonian ideal here?
We talk about that a lot, and I think that is the reality of looking at Jefferson's life and looking at the full measure of his complexity, which does include the fact that this is a man who believed in a democracy, that believed that people could govern themselves, but his vision of the people was limited. It's important to have that conversation, but maybe one of the most important aspects of it is that Jefferson himself knew that these things would change. And he wrote about that a great deal, and he had a radical vision of progress. One of the quotes that gets thrown around here a lot is that, the earth belongs and usufruct to the living. The dead have neither rights nor powers over it. So by his own words, this conversation about Jefferson and what he thought having an impact on our world today, it has a legacy for sure, but he himself would have said it didn't really matter what he thought.
Exactly. It brings us full circle. Why do we go back to the founders, these pre-Darwin, pre-modern, pre-industrial men living in an agricultural society? Well, I think there is some usefulness there.
Yeah, and I think what Brandon just said is especially important. There are reasons to go back to Jefferson above all, because he does not believe that the republic is locked into place and defined by the current constitutional arrangements of his own time. He hopes that it will evolve, he expects that it will evolve, and he thinks that human potential is virtually infinite.
So as we've been discussing here, Thomas Jefferson's legacy is complicated. And the man in all his complexities and importance in the American story presents institutions such as Monticello with the challenge of preserving that legacy, while also educating generations of people of all races, religions, and political persuasions. And we're going to build on that in our next conversation as History as It Happens goes on location, podcasting from Monticello with Brandon Dillard and Alan Taylor, a podcast from the Washington Times.